The 1980s, questionable fashion, questionable music, unquestionably a great time to be a kid growing up in the suburbs of Canberra in Australia. Well, it was for me anyway. This is me, and these are my grandparents, my bupcha and Judek. Although I had never been there, by the time this photo was taken, I knew quite a lot about the faraway country of Poland. As you can see here, I knew all about the Polish national dress. And of course, I knew that Poland was where my bupcha and Judek had lived before they came to Australia. I knew the language spoken there and the food that was eaten, as it was the same sounds and smells that filled my grandparents' home. Although I knew all of these things and more about Poland, what I didn't know anything about was the meaning behind the two words that were the reason for my bupcha and Judek's move. And in my 1980s suburban childhood, none of that seemed important to understand. To me, my bupcha and Judek was simply my grandparents, and all I cared about was that they were now here in Australia with me. As I grew up, I became aware of more terms that sat alongside this mysterious war. By the time I realised what it all meant for my grandparents' past, it was too late to ask them about their experiences. My first visit to Poland was long after my grandparents had passed away. I instantly fell in love with the country and the people, and of course the food. It wasn't until I travelled there again a few years later with my mum and auntie that I finally met some of the family that my grandparents had left behind. It was with these strangers, who were also somehow instantly familiar, that I learned more about the people that my bupcha and Judek were before I knew them. It was through them that I began to understand what it meant to be labelled a displaced person during World War II. My bupcha, Zofia Dudzinska, was born on the 20th of October 1919 into a family that included one brother and one sister. My Judek, František Novak, was born on the 30th of December 1919. He was the second youngest of 10 brothers and 2 sisters. When both of my grandparents were 20 years old, their lives changed forever when Poland was invaded by Germany. By this time, my bupcha was living in Warsaw, next to what became the site of the Warsaw Ghetto. During the 1943 uprising, she helped nurse the wounded resistors. Not long after, she was sent by the Nazis to Germany to work in slave labour. Meanwhile, German soldiers were moving door to door, taking the youngest of each household away to work. When they came knocking on my Judek's family home, he, the second youngest, volunteered instead in order to save his brother. In 1945, World War II was finally declared over. Although dancing in the street was recorded in Australia, for my grandparents, the true end of the war took a little longer to arrive. Many survivors had been taken from their homelands to work in German industry. Others fled their homes in the face of occupation. When the war ended, they were either unable or unwilling to return home. My bupcha and Judek met in Germany while they were both living in one of the many refugee camps that were situated across Europe. They were married in 1946 in Solingen. Soon after, they had to make a difficult choice about their future. They were now officially displaced from their homes, as the Poland they once knew was no longer safe. Between 1947 and 1953, more than 170,000 people arrived into Australia as displaced persons. My grandparents left their families behind and created a new family out of the people they met on the ship that brought them to Australia. Along with the majority of the other assisted immigrants, my bupcha and Judek were initially sent to the Bonagilla migrant camp. Here they were introduced to both Australian life and the English language. In 1949, they settled together in the suburb of Yarralumla in Canberra. My auntie was born soon after, and my mum's arrival in 1951 completed the family. Frank and Sophie Novak became proud Australian citizens in the 1960s. So, what did it mean to be labelled a displaced person? While it is easy to research the definition, what is not so easy to understand is how that reality felt for my bupcha and Judek. Growing up with the greatest grandparents I could ask for, it was easy to not question what their life was like before I came along. To me, my bupcha and Judek belonged to us. To me, to my brother, to my mum and dad, and auntie and uncle here in Australia. But as much as I feel connected to my family here, there is no doubt that my grandparents felt the same connection to their family back in Poland. It wasn't until I visited them there that the true reality of the consequences of war hit home. that the people displaced are not only the ones that leave, they are also the ones left behind.